T.S. Eliot's essay, The Function of Criticism, is an important text that outlines his views on the role and purpose of literary criticism. Published in 1923, the essay responds to the prevailing critical approaches of the time and argues for a more disciplined and objective form of criticism. Key points of The Function of Criticism. Distinction between creation and criticism. Eliot makes a clear distinction between the creation of literature and its criticism. He believes that the two activities are fundamentally different and should not be confused. The creation of literature is an intuitive and imaginative process, whereas criticism requires a more analytical and systematic approach. Impersonality in criticism. Eliot argues for impersonality in criticism. He suggests that criticism should be objective and focused on the work itself rather than the personal responses or emotions of the critic. This aligns with his broader poetic theory that emphasizes the impersonal nature of art, where the poet's personal experiences and emotions are transformed into universal truths. Historical sense. Eliot stresses the importance of a historical sense in criticism. He believes that a good critic must understand the historical context of a work and its relation to the literary tradition. This involves not only an awareness of past literature but also an understanding of how a particular work fits within the continuum of literary history. Role of criticism. According to Eliot, the primary function of criticism is the elucidation and evaluation of literary works. Criticism should help readers understand and appreciate the complexities of a text. It should provide insights into the structure, style, and meaning of a work, thereby enhancing the reader's experience and understanding. Relationship between critic and poet. Eliot discusses the relationship between the critic and the poet, suggesting that while the critic's role is to analyze and interpret, they should not impose their own creative vision on the work. The critic should respect the integrity of the text and strive to uncover the intentions and techniques of the author. Criticism is an art form. Eliot also views criticism as a creative and intellectual activity in its own right. He believes that just as a poet brings a unique vision to their work, a good critic brings a rigorous and insightful perspective to the analysis of literature. Criticism, therefore, requires a high degree of skill and knowledge. Implications of Eliot's views. Objective standards. Eliot's call for objectivity and impersonality in criticism implies the need for certain standards and criteria that can be applied consistently. This counters the subjective and impressionistic approaches that were common in his time. Value of tradition. By emphasizing the historical sense, Eliot underscores the importance of tradition in shaping and evaluating literature. This suggests that new works should be understood and judged in relation to the literary heritage from which they emerge. Critic's responsibility. Eliot's views place a significant responsibility on the critic. The critic must be knowledgeable, discerning, and fair, providing interpretations that illuminate rather than distort the text. Conclusion. T.S. Eliot's The Function of Criticism remains a foundational text in literary theory, advocating for a disciplined, objective, and historically informed approach to literary criticism. His emphasis on the separation of creative and critical activities, the importance of impersonality, and the need for a deep understanding of literary tradition continue to influence contemporary critical practice. Let's break down T.S. Eliot's key points from The Function of Criticism, with simpler definitions and examples. Key points with simple definitions and examples. Distinction between creation and criticism. Definition. Creating literature, like writing a poem or a story, is different from analyzing and evaluating it doing criticism. Example. Writing a poem about nature is creating literature. Writing an essay that explains what the poem means and how it uses language is doing criticism. Impersonality in criticism. Definition. Criticism should focus on the work itself, not the critic's personal feelings or the author's life. Example. Instead of saying, "I didn't like the poem because it made me sad," a critic might say, "The poem uses dark imagery and somber tones to convey a sense of sadness." Historical sense. Definition. A good critic understands the historical context of a work and how it relates to other literature. Example. When analyzing Shakespeare's plays, a critic considers the social and historical context of the 16th century and how Shakespeare's work was influenced by earlier writers like Chaucer. Role of criticism. Definition. The main job of criticism is to explain and evaluate literary works to help readers understand and appreciate them. Example. A critic might write an article explaining how a novel's structure and themes reflect the author's views on society, helping readers see deeper meanings they might have missed. Relationship between critic and poet. Definition: critics should analyze and interpret works without imposing their own creative ideas on them. Example: if a critic is reviewing a poem, they should focus on what the poem itself is trying to convey, rather than suggesting how they would have written it differently. Criticism is an art form. Definition: criticism itself is a creative and intellectual activity that requires skill and knowledge. Example: a well-written book review that offers deep insights into a novel's themes, style, and cultural significance is an example of criticism as an art form. Simplified overview. Creating verses. Criticizing. Writing stories is different from analyzing them. Objective focus. Criticism should be about the work, not personal feelings. Understanding history. Knowing the historical context helps in understanding literature. Explaining and evaluating. The job of criticism is to explain and evaluate works. Respecting the work. Critics should interpret without changing the author's intent. Art of criticism. Good criticism is a skilled and thoughtful activity. Example in practice. Imagine you are reading a poem. Poem: the sky is gray, the wind is cold, the leaves fall down, stories untold. Creating literature. Writing this poem is an act of creation. Doing criticism. Writing about how the poem uses weather to symbolize feelings of sadness and loss is an act of criticism. Objective criticism. A critic might say, the use of gray skies and falling leaves in the poem symbolizes the passage of time and in spoken stories, rather than, I feel sad when I read this poem. Historical context. If the poem was written during a war, understanding this can help explain the themes of loss and melancholy. By keeping these principles in mind, critics can help readers gain a deeper understanding and appreciation of literary works. Here are the main arguments of T.S. Eliot's The Function of Criticism, each accompanied by a simple example to illustrate the point. Main arguments with examples. Distinction between creation and criticism. Argument: creating literature, writing poems, novels, etc., is fundamentally different from critiquing literature, analyzing and evaluating it. Each requires a different skill set and approach. Example: creation: writing a short story about a hero's journey. Criticism: writing an essay that analyzes how the short story uses mythological references and narrative structure to convey the hero's transformation. Impersonality in criticism. Argument: criticism should be impersonal and objective, focusing on the work itself rather than the critic's personal feelings or the author's biography. Example: personal response: I didn't like the poem because it made me feel sad. Impersonal criticism: the poem uses dark imagery and a somber tone to evoke a sense of melancholy and reflection on loss. Historical sense. Argument: critics need a historical sense to understand a work in its historical context and its relation to the literary tradition. This involves understanding both the past and the present influences on the work. Example: historical context: analyzing Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, by considering the historical backdrop of the French Revolution and how it shapes the novel's themes of sacrifice and redemption. Role of criticism. Argument: the main function of criticism is to explain and evaluate literary works. Critics should help readers understand the complexities of a text and appreciate its artistic merits. Example: explanatory criticism: writing a detailed analysis of a poem's use of metaphor and symbolism to convey deeper meanings about life and death, thereby helping readers see beyond the surface level. Relationship between critic and poet. Argument: critics should analyze and interpret works without imposing their own creative ideas or personal biases. The critic's role is to uncover the author's intentions and techniques, not to rewrite the work. Example: respectful criticism: when reviewing a novel, focusing on how the author develops characters and themes rather than suggesting how the story should have been written differently. Criticism is an art form. Argument: criticism is a creative and intellectual activity that requires skill, knowledge, and insight. Good criticism itself can be seen as an art form. Example: artful criticism: a well-written literary critique that provides deep insights, connects the work to broader themes and traditions, and enhances the reader's understanding and enjoyment of the text. Simplified example: imagine a novel about a young girl growing up in a war-torn country. Here's how these principles apply. Distinction between creation and criticism. writing the novel is an act of creation. Analyzing how the novel portrays the effects of war on childhood is an act of criticism. Impersonality in criticism. Instead of saying, "I felt very moved by the girl's story," a critic might say, "The novel uses vivid imagery and realistic dialogue to depict the harsh realities of war." Historical sense. Understanding the historical context of the war and how it influences the story helps in appreciating the novel's depth. Role of criticism. Explaining how the novel uses symbolism and narrative structure to convey its themes helps readers understand and appreciate it more. Relationship between critic and poet. Focusing on what the novel achieves rather than suggesting how it could have been different respects the author's creative vision. Criticism is an art form. Writing a thoughtful and insightful review that connects the novel to larger themes in literature can be seen as a form of art in itself. By applying these principles, critics can provide valuable insights that enhance the understanding and appreciation of literary works. Let's delve deeper into each of T.S. Eliot's arguments from The Function of Criticism, with more detailed examples. Main arguments with detailed examples. Distinction between creation and criticism. Argument. Creating literature involves imagination and inspiration, while criticism involves analysis and evaluation. They are separate activities that require different approaches. Example. Creation. J.K. Rowling writing Harry Potter is an act of creation, where she uses her imagination to build a magical world and develop a plot and characters. Criticism. A literary critic writing an essay on Harry Potter, analyzing themes such as the battle between good and evil, the hero's journey, and the social issues reflected in the series like discrimination and prejudice. Impersonality in criticism. Argument. Criticism should be objective and detached, focusing on the text itself rather than personal feelings or the author's life. Example. Personal response. I love Pride and Prejudice because it reminds me of my own experiences with love. Impersonal criticism. Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice uses wit and irony to critique the class structure and gender norms of early 19th century England. Historical sense. Argument. A good critic understands the historical context of a work and its place in literary tradition. This helps in interpreting the work more deeply. Example. Historical context. When analyzing George Orwell's 1984, understanding the historical context of post-World War II and the rise of totalitarian regimes provides insights into the novel's themes of surveillance, propaganda, and loss of individuality. Role of criticism. Argument. The primary function of criticism is to explain and evaluate literary works to help readers understand and appreciate them better. Example. Explanatory criticism. A critic explaining how F. Scott Fitzgerald's use of symbolism in The Great Gatsby, such as the green light and the Valley of Ashes, contributes to the novel's themes of the American dream and moral decay. Relationship between critic and poet. Argument. Critics should respect the author's work and interpret it rather than impose their own creative ideas. Example. Respectful criticism. When critiquing Emily Dickinson's poetry, a critic should focus on interpreting her use of unconventional punctuation and capitalization to enhance meaning, rather than suggesting she should have written in a more traditional style. Criticism is an art form. Argument. Good criticism is a creative and intellectual activity that requires skill and insight. It is an art form in itself. Example. Artful criticism. A literary essay that provides a nuanced interpretation of James Joyce's Ulysses, connecting its stream of consciousness technique to modernist literary movements and exploring its rich layers of symbolism and mythological references, can be seen as a work of art. Additional points with examples. Impersonality and objectivity. Argument. Critics should strive for objectivity, separating their personal feelings from their analysis. Example. Instead of saying, "I didn't like The Catcher in the Rye because Holden Caulfield is too whiny," a critic might say, "Salinger's portrayal of Holden Caulfield's angst and rebellion effectively captures the struggles of teenage identity and alienation." Critical methodology. Argument. Critics should employ a systematic and rigorous approach to analyzing texts. Example. Using structuralist methodology to break down the narrative structure of a novel and understand how its elements, plot, characters, themes interact to produce meaning. Influence of tradition. Argument. Critics should recognize the influence of literary tradition on a work. Example. Analyzing T.S. Eliot's own, The Waste Land, in the context of its references to classical literature, myth, and other literary works to understand its complex intertextuality. Engagement with theories. Argument. Critics should engage with literary theories to deepen their analysis. Example. Applying feminist theory to Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, to explore its critique of the limitations placed on women writers in a patriarchal society. Criticism's contribution to literature. Argument. Good criticism can enhance the literary value and understanding of a text. Example. A critical analysis that reveals the underlying themes and stylistic innovations in Toni Morrison's Beloved can help readers appreciate the novel's exploration of memory, trauma, and the African American experience. By adhering to these principles, critics can provide valuable interpretations that enrich the reader's engagement with literary works, fostering a deeper appreciation and understanding of literature. Main arguments with detailed explanations and examples. Distinction between creation and criticism. Argument. Creating literature involves imaginative and emotional engagement, while criticism requires analytical and intellectual skills. The creative process is personal and subjective, whereas criticism should be more structured and objective. Example. Creation. A novelist like Gabriel Garcia Marquez writing 100 Years of Solitude uses magical realism to create a vivid, fantastical narrative that explores the complexities of Latin American culture and history. Criticism. A critic might analyze 100 Years of Solitude by examining its narrative techniques, such as magical realism, and how they serve to critique colonialism and political turmoil in Latin America. Impersonality in criticism. Argument. Criticism should focus on the text itself rather than the critic's personal reactions or the author's biography. Impersonal criticism helps maintain objectivity and ensures that the work is analyzed on its own merits. Example. Personal response. I felt confused by the ending of The Road, by Cormac McCarthy. Impersonal criticism. The ambiguous ending of The Road reflects the novel's themes of uncertainty and the struggle for hope in a post-apocalyptic world. Historical sense. Argument. Understanding the historical context in which a work was written is crucial for proper interpretation. This involves recognizing the influence of past works and the literary tradition to which the current work belongs. Example. Historical context. Analyzing Mary Shelley's Frankenstein by considering the scientific advancements and philosophical debates of the early 19th century, such as the Industrial Revolution and the Romantic movements. Reaction to it. Role of criticism. Argument. The main function of criticism is to elucidate and evaluate literary works. Critics should help readers understand the deeper meanings, themes, and artistic techniques in a text, enhancing their appreciation of literature. Example. Explanatory criticism. A critic might explain how the use of stream of consciousness in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse allows readers to delve into the inner thoughts and emotions of the characters, providing a deeper understanding of their psychological complexity. Relationship between critic and poet. Argument. Critics should interpret and analyze works without imposing their own creative ideas. The critic's role is to reveal the author's intentions and the work's inherent qualities, not to rewrite or judge it based on personal preferences. Example. Respectful criticism. When critiquing Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, focusing on Hemingway's minimalist writing style and how it reflects the protagonist's stoic resilience, rather than suggesting the story would be better with a different ending. Criticism is an art form. Argument. Good criticism is not just about evaluating works, it is a creative and intellectual endeavor that requires skill and insight. It should provide new perspectives and deepen the reader's understanding. Example. Artful criticism. A well-crafted essay on Toni Morrison's Beloved that explores the novel's use of magical realism, symbolism, and historical context to address themes of slavery, memory, and identity can itself be seen as a work of art. Additional points with more examples. Impersonality and objectivity. Argument. Critics should strive for objectivity by focusing on the text itself rather than their personal reactions. Example. Instead of saying, I found The Metamorphosis by Kafka disturbing, a critic might say, Kafka's use of surreal transformation in The Metamorphosis highlights the alienation and absurdity of modern life. Critical methodology. Argument. Critics should employ systematic and rigorous methods to analyze texts, ensuring a thorough and coherent interpretation. Example: using psychoanalytic criticism to explore the unconscious motivations of characters in Shakespeare's Hamlet, revealing deeper insights into Hamlet's behavior and the play's themes of madness and revenge. Influence of tradition. Argument: recognizing the influence of literary tradition on a work helps in understanding its place within the broader literary landscape. Example: analyzing T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, by considering its references to classical literature, mythology, and previous poets like Dante and Shakespeare, thereby appreciating its rich intertextuality and modernist innovation. Engagement with theories. Argument: engaging with various literary theories can provide deeper and more diverse perspectives on a text. Example: applying Marxist criticism to Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, to examine how the novella critiques capitalist society and advocates for social reform through the transformation of Scrooge. Criticism's contribution to literature. Argument: good criticism can enhance the literary value and understanding of a text, contributing to its appreciation and interpretation. Example: a critical analysis of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, that highlights its portrayal of pre-colonial African culture and the impacts of European colonization, helping readers appreciate its historical and cultural significance. Illustrative example: To Kill a Mockingbird, by Harper Lee. Distinction between creation and criticism. Creation: Harper Lee wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, a novel about racial injustice and moral growth in the American South. Criticism: a critic analyzes the novel's themes of racism, the moral development of Scout and Atticus Finch, and its commentary on social justice. Impersonality in criticism. Personal response: I love To Kill a Mockingbird, because it reminds me of my own childhood. Impersonal criticism: the novel's depiction of racial injustice and the moral courage of its characters serves as a powerful critique of societal prejudices. Historical sense. Historical context. Understanding the historical context of the Great Depression and the Civil Rights Movement enriches the interpretation of the novel's themes and social commentary. Role of criticism. Explanatory criticism. Explaining how Lee uses the perspective of a child to address complex issues like racism and moral integrity, making these themes accessible and impactful for readers. Relationship between critic and poet. Respectful criticism. Analyzing how Lee's narrative choices, such as the use of a child narrator and the setting in a small southern town, enhance the novel's exploration of innocence and justice without suggesting alternative storytelling methods. Criticism is an art form. Artful criticism. A critical essay that not only analyzes the novel's themes and techniques but also connects them to broader cultural and historical contexts, providing new insights and enhancing the reader's appreciation of the work. By adhering to these principles, critics can provide valuable interpretations that enrich the reader's engagement with literary works, fostering a deeper appreciation and understanding of literature. T.S. Eliot's essay, The Function of Criticism, holds significant relevance and legacy in the field of literary criticism. Here, I will outline its significance, relevance, legacy, contribution, and impact. Significance. T.S. Eliot's essay is significant because it defines the role of criticism. Eliot distinguishes between the act of creating literature and the act of critiquing it, emphasizing the need for objective and impersonal criticism. Promotes historical awareness. He stresses the importance of understanding literary works within their historical context and the broader literary tradition. Advocates for impersonality. Eliot argues that criticism should focus on the text itself rather than the critic's personal feelings or the author's life, promoting an objective approach to literary analysis. Relevance. The relevance of Eliot's arguments today includes continued need for objective criticism. Eliot's call for impersonal and objective criticism remains pertinent as it encourages critics to focus on textual analysis rather than subjective impressions. Influence on contemporary criticism. Modern literary criticism often involves various theoretical frameworks, such as structuralism, post-structuralism, and historical criticism, that align with Eliot's emphasis on rigorous and systematic analysis. Educational framework. Eliot's principles are still taught in literary studies, forming the foundation for understanding the role and function of criticism. Legacy. Eliot's legacy in literary criticism is profound. Shaping modern criticism. His ideas have influenced generations of critics and scholars, contributing to the development of modern critical theory. Enduring text. The Function of Criticism, remains a seminal text, frequently referenced and studied in literary courses. Critical standards. Eliot established high standards for literary criticism, advocating for a disciplined and scholarly approach that continues to inspire and guide critics. Contribution. Eliot's contributions to literary criticism include framework for analysis, providing a clear framework for what constitutes effective and meaningful criticism. Promotion of historical context, emphasizing the importance of situating literary works within their historical and cultural contexts. Influence on critical practices. His work has influenced various critical practices and methodologies, encouraging a more nuanced and comprehensive approach to literary analysis. Impact. The impact of Eliot's essay can be seen in academic discourse, shaping the discourse around the purpose and methods of literary criticism in academic settings. Critical theory development, influencing the development of various critical theories that value historical context and objective analysis. Critical standards, raising the standards for literary criticism by promoting thorough, well-informed, and impersonal analysis. Examples illustrating the impact. Historical criticism. Eliot's principle, understanding the historical context of a work. Example, critics analyzing George Orwell's 1984 consider the post-World War II context and the rise of totalitarian regimes to understand the novel's themes of surveillance and oppression. Impersonal criticism. Eliot's principle, focusing on the text rather than personal feelings or author's life. Example, when critiquing Sylvia Plath's Bell Jar, critics focus on its themes and narrative style rather than Plath's personal history, despite its autobiographical elements. Objective analysis. Eliot's principle, objective and systematic criticism. Example, structuralist critics analyze a text's underlying structures and relationships, as seen in Roland Barthes' work on narrative structures. Influence on educational practices. Eliot's principle, educating future critics on rigorous analysis. Example, literature courses worldwide incorporate Eliot's principles, teaching students to approach texts with an objective and analytical mindset. By promoting a disciplined and scholarly approach, T.S. Eliot's The Function of Criticism has left an indelible mark on the field of literary criticism, ensuring its continued relevance and influence in contemporary literary studies. Here's a summary and analysis of T.S. Eliot's essay, The Function of Criticism, including an examination of its themes and comments on its significance. Summary. The Function of Criticism, by T.S. Eliot is an influential essay that outlines the proper role and approach of literary criticism. Eliot argues that the primary function of criticism is to elucidate and evaluate literary works, helping readers understand and appreciate them better. He emphasizes the importance of impersonality in criticism, suggesting that critics should focus on the text itself rather than their personal feelings or the author's biography. Eliot also highlights the need for critics to have a historical sense, understanding the literary tradition and the historical context in which a work was written. He distinguishes between the creation of literature and the analysis of it, asserting that each requires different skills and approaches. Analysis. Eliot's essay is structured around several key arguments. Distinction between creation and criticism. Eliot posits that creating literature and critiquing literature are fundamentally different activities. Writers create works of art through imagination and emotional engagement, while critics analyze and evaluate these works through intellectual and analytical skills. Impersonality in criticism. He argues that criticism should be objective and impersonal. Critics should avoid letting their personal biases or the author's personal life influence their analysis. Instead, they should focus on the text itself, aiming for an objective understanding of its themes, structure, and style. Historical sense. Eliot emphasizes the importance of understanding a work within its historical context and its place in the literary tradition. A good critic needs to be aware of how past works influence the present and how a particular work fits into the broader literary landscape. Role of criticism. The main function of criticism, according to Eliot, is to explain and evaluate literary works. Critics should help readers appreciate the complexities of a text and understand its artistic merits. Relationship between critic and poet. Eliot believes that critics should respect the author's work and aim to uncover the author's intentions and techniques. Critics should not impose their own creative ideas or rewrite the work but rather interpret and analyze it. Criticism is an art form. Eliot asserts that good criticism is a creative and intellectual activity. It requires skill, knowledge, and insight, and it can itself be considered an art. Form. Themes. Impersonality and objectivity. Eliot's insistence on impersonal criticism is a central theme. He believes that objectivity is crucial for a fair and thorough analysis of literary works. Historical context. Understanding the historical context and literary tradition is another key theme. Eliot argues that critics must have a sense of history to properly interpret and evaluate texts. Function and purpose of criticism. The essay explores the role of criticism in literature, emphasizing its importance in helping readers appreciate and understand literary works. Interplay between creation and analysis. The distinction and relationship between the creation of literature and its criticism is a recurring theme. Eliot underscores that these are separate but complementary activities. Comments and examination. Eliot's essay has had a lasting impact on the field of literary criticism. His emphasis on impersonality and objectivity has shaped the way critics approach texts, promoting a more disciplined and rigorous method of analysis. By insisting on the importance of historical context, Eliot has encouraged critics to consider the broader literary and cultural environment in which a work was produced. However, Eliot's ideas have also been the subject of debate. Some critics argue that his emphasis on impersonality can lead to a detached and overly clinical approach to literature, neglecting the emotional and subjective aspects of reading. Additionally, the rise of various critical theories, such as feminist, post-colonial, and psychoanalytic criticism, has challenged Eliot's notion of objectivity, suggesting that personal and cultural contexts are essential for a fuller understanding of literary works. Impact and legacy. Eliot's essay remains a seminal text in literary criticism. It continues to be studied and referenced for its clear articulation of the principles and functions of criticism. Eliot's ideas about the importance of historical context and the need for objective analysis have influenced many critical methodologies and educational practices. Despite evolving theories and approaches in literary criticism, the function of criticism provides a foundational framework that has shaped the discipline and continues to inform contemporary critical practices. By examining Eliot's arguments and themes, we gain a deeper understanding of the principles that underpin effective literary criticism and the ongoing relevance of his insights in the analysis and appreciation of literature. T.S. Eliot, in addition to being a renowned poet, was also a highly influential literary critic whose contributions have had a lasting impact on the field of literary studies. Here, we'll explore Eliot's role as a critic and his major contributions. T.S. Eliot is a critic. Promoter of modernist literature. Eliot's critical essays, such as Tradition and the Individual Talent, and The Sacred Wood, played a significant role in defining and promoting modernist literature. He emphasized the importance of tradition in shaping individual talent and argued for a break from the literary conventions of the past. Reviver of metaphysical poetry. Eliot's essay, The Metaphysical Poets, revived interest in the 17th-century metaphysical poets, such as John Donne and George Herbert. He praised their use of complex imagery and intellectual wit, influencing the study and appreciation of this poetic tradition. Champion of literary tradition. Eliot believed that literature should be understood in the context of the literary tradition to which it belongs. His essays emphasize the importance of understanding a work's historical and cultural background in interpreting its meaning. Critique of Romanticism. Eliot critiqued the Romantic poets, particularly their emphasis on individualism and emotion. He argued for a more objective and intellectual approach to poetry, which he believed was lacking in the Romantic tradition. Advocate for impersonality. Eliot emphasized the need for critics to be impersonal in their analysis, focusing on the text rather than their personal feelings or the author's biography. He believed that criticism should be objective and detached. Innovator of critical methodologies. Eliot's critical essays introduced innovative methods of literary analysis, such as the objective correlative, and the concept of the dissociation of sensibility, which have been influential in literary criticism. Contributions to literary criticism. Promotion of new critical approaches. Eliot's emphasis on close reading and textual analysis, as well as his rejection of biographical and historical criticism, contributed to the development of new criticism in the mid-20th century. Impact on literary theory. Eliot's ideas have had a significant impact on literary theory, influencing the development of structuralism, formalism, and other critical approaches that emphasize textual analysis and the study of literary form. Legacy in literary studies. Eliot's essays and critical writings continue to be studied and debated in literary studies. His ideas about tradition, impersonality, and the role of the critic remain influential in shaping critical discourse. Bridge between poetry and criticism. Eliot's dual role as both a poet and a critic allowed him to offer unique insights into the creative process. His criticism often reflected his own poetic sensibilities, blurring the lines between criticism and creative writing. Reflection of cultural context. Eliot's criticism reflects the cultural and intellectual climate of his time, particularly the aftermath of World War I and the rise of modernism. His essays are often a response to the cultural and literary debates of his era. Overall, T.S. Eliot's contributions to literary criticism have been profound, shaping the way we think about literature and influencing generations of scholars and critics. His essays remain essential reading for anyone interested in the study of literature and the practice of criticism.